Okay, wrapping up a couple of things at the end of this chapter. How fast does evolution happen? The main driver of evolution is changes in conditions. Either the conditions change around you, or a group winds up someplace where the conditions are pretty different from the conditions they originated from. But the more dramatic the change, the faster the change, sometimes too fast. Things go extinct when conditions change too fast. But condition changes are the main driving force of evolution. When we talked about the two different types of reproduction, we talked about sexual reproduction having the advantage of variation. In a group, there's not a lot of differences, there's a lot of differences amongst the individuals. So there's a lot of traits to pick and choose as conditions change for the winners and losers. Whereas asexual reproduction, you're making genetic copies, the potential isn't there as strongly unless you crank out so many of them that you do get some variation in it. But still, the variation is somewhat limited. So these two things together drive evolutionary rates. And it can be, different at different times, different in different places, different in different niches. There are some living things like horseshoe crabs and open water sharks, where if you go into the fossil record, you find a horseshoe crab, looks pretty much like a horseshoe crab does today, even though it's 250 million years old. What you can find is sharks. Sharks don't have bony skeletons, so mostly their teeth fossilized, but you can find remnants. They haven't changed much either. But then horseshoe crabs live on the fringes of the ocean. They are in the surf zone, browsing off the bottom. They're really good at it. They're very well protected. Those surf zones have existed in that form for a really, really, really long time. They move around, the continents move around, not so fast that the horseshoe crabs can't keep up with it. And so you find a very successful form in an ecosystem part, a niche that hasn't changed really. So why should they change? They're really good at living that way. Open water sharks, very good predators. As long as there's things to sneak up on and take a bite out of, very, very good at it. They have not changed. And actually what you find in these, you know how they've evolved? They've evolved a resistance to evolution. Their DNA is much more robust, any kind of change in their DNA, they fix way better than we do. Because they've kind of stabilized in their successful form. If their ecosystem and their niche does change, they're kind of screwed because they're going to have less variation, because they're not going to get the variation for mutations that you get on top of other types of variation. But things that are living fossils that seem to be very similar to their ancient ancestors almost always exist in a part of the ecosystem that has stayed stable for a really, really long time. Later on, we'll talk about mass extinctions as part of the history of life on Earth. But what it basically amounts to is sometimes the conditions change so quickly and so dramatically that huge swaths of many, many different populations just can't deal. They just die out. Is that your mass extinctions usually, whatever starts them off, the first main effect they have is to wipe out most of the plants, take out the bottom of the food chain, and then everything else kind of falls to crap. But a mass extinction is defined as, in the fossil record, from one layer to the next, better than 50% of the species in the older layer aren't there anymore in the next newer layer. They've disappeared. And so it's kind of tied to fossils. We talk about us producing a mass extinction now. where we may be wiping out better than half of the species that are around. But that's actually more than, because not all the species wind up in the fossil record. We may be doing a much bigger job of eliminating them, although the Permian extinction wiped out over 90% of the species from one layer to the next layer. Okay, as I said, this was gonna be a really short one, so that's a really short one.